I think when I started photographing, to a large extent, I thought of photography as um, this practice or place or thing that had a big wall around it. Um, and because I could perceive that wall, whether it was a wall that was built of access or built of class or built of built from the prohibitive expense of photography in the late 80s and early 90s. It was a wall that I kind of I that I felt like I recognized, and that I felt like, I just needed to honor that wall. And I spent a bunch of time waiting to be invited over the wall. Um, and that invitation didn't come. Um, and I recognized that early when I took my first stab at being a photographer in my early 20s. Um, After some friends of mine died in car accidents, and I had a kind of period of clinical depression, and I was like, all right, like, you know, what I want to do is I want to stop time, and I've always wanted to photograph, and time is pressing up against me, and I'm going to, just claim that thing that I'm interested in. And it's photography. So I'm going to make that mine. I'm going to use the camera to stop time. I'm going to use camera to record these relationships. And if I had done more of that, I would have had more relics of those really important early relationships that ended too soon, because people dying. Um, so I put the camera down, shortly after I picked it up to take care of my mom who had multiple sclerosis. And yeah, there's about 8 years of super intense caregiving, where I was the sole caregiver for her as she um, struggled with, often overcame, uh, the challenges of dealing with a chronic illness, and certainly met them, courageously and head on in a lot of ways. And there was an education for me in that. A lot of people saw somebody who was suffering, and I saw somebody who on a daily basis was like, teaching life lessons in survival and courage and determination, um, ferocity, strength. And I was like, well, I have a front row seat to the greatest show on earth. And people were like, how do you deal with all that suffering? And I was like, what are you talking about? Um, but eventually that front row seat, and all the work that came with holding on to that front row seat, ended up with exhaustion and depression. I started photographing um, shortly after, um, realizing that I needed to do something to work through this period of chronic depression. At the time, I had no idea what something meant. And I didn't even know what I was interested in anymore, because I'd been painting houses and taking care of my mom for almost a decade in my 20s, when, every many of the other people that I knew were answering to their curiosities or making plans. My ability to plan had long since disappeared. And I just had to do and be and react. And eventually I remembered that I wanted to photograph. And that's what I started to do. So, um, I started just playing with photography instead of trying to make a living from it or make a statement with it. It was like, the camera is going to be my passport, and it's going to open the gates to whatever I'm curious about. And that's how I treated it for the first year, 2 years that I was photographing. And I would develop excuses to photograph, reasons or trips to photograph, outings to photograph, but I would also just keep a camera in my pocket and use that, when I saw something that resonated with me that I wanted to acknowledge and record. And I think, the impulse um, to collaborate um, came with the recognition that I had, that the kind of wall that I perceived around photography wasn't real. It was an artifact. It was an artifact of classism. It was an artifact of um, a whole variety of experiences that said to me, this isn't yours, and can't be yours. Um, but I found that it wasn't a wall. There was more of a permeable membrane, and I was in the other side of it. I was somehow like in photography, whatever the hell that meant. Um, and I think the urge to collaborate was always the urge to just share that secret. Like, it's not a wall, guys. That's not a wall. There's no wall around this. There's no wall that says you can't be curious. Because remember, photography for me was a way to unleash and activate and engage in my curiosities. Um, it was a passport, like literally to other countries, figuratively to other worlds, metaphorically to myself. Like, and when I discovered that, I couldn't keep that shit a secret. It was like, all right, you know what? Other people need to know that there's no wall around this, that it's like, in fact, it's the opposite of a wall. It's a tool for engagement. And so I always made it part of the work that I do. Um, as I developed a career, found opportunities to do documentary photography work. Um, Teaching was always braided into that practice. So if I was interested in the slums in Kenya, and so I took on a few mentees, apprentice photographers in Korogocho. And if I was going to photograph in Korogocho, I was going to have, you know, 2, 3 young teenagers, 20-year-old youth, like, who had expressed an interest. And and I wanted, to be able to mentor them in photography, because they were like, hey, how did you do this? And I was like, hey, there's no wall. It's like, you got to invite yourself in. You walk in, and the camera will help you get wherever you want to go. And so, um, those early projects where I wanted to kind of share and invite others into photography, but also into the realm of their own activated curiosities, was really what drove the early collaborations that I did.